You and I connected a couple of years ago when I reached out to you regarding a book that I had been writing, Rethinking Rest. And that book was my attempt to take some of your work, specifically the idea of God resting on the seventh day there in Genesis, chapters 1 and 2. And I was trying to practically apply that ancient Near Eastern idea of that concept of a believer to what it would look like if we played it out for a believer. So first, thank you very much for everything you did for me on that project. And secondly, have you had a lot of people try and take some of the concepts that you've introduced in your work and then take them in and build on them in other directions like that?
It has happened, not so much on the popular book level, but there have been a number of dissertations that people have done, picking up one piece or another of things that I've talked about. So it shows up on a more popular level book, often in terms of methodology, when they try to take my methodology and apply it.
Good. And I mentioned the Lost World of Genesis 1. I think maybe in lay circles, that's probably your best known work. That's how people are most often introduced to your work. But if you had to pick one or two other titles that if people have read that first book and maybe are looking for a second or a third to get introduced a little more to you, do you have a couple of suggestions that people might pick up?
Yeah. Well, of course, there are 6 books now in the Lost World series, and a 7th one is just ready to come out. So lots of times people move from one to the other of those. But I think if people really want to get acquainted with my work in general, there are kind of 3 different directions they could go. If they want to understand more about the ancient Near East, they could use my book, Ancient Near Eastern Thought and the Old Testament. That's kind of an introductory primer to that whole area. If they want to understand Old Testament theology more, I've got a book for that. It's called Old Testament Theology for Christians, and that's where they could get that information. And if they really were just interested in my hermeneutics, my methods for approaching scriptural interpretation, my book that just came out is called Wisdom for Faithful Reading, Principles and Practices for Old Testament Interpretation. So that's a place that people could get that. If they just want to understand more about kind of the cultural context for the Old Testament, then they could get something like the NIV Cultural Background Study Bible, for which I was the Old Testament general editor, along with Craig Keener in the New Testament. So those are different ways that people could get into the information.